The wrestling world stood still when Linda Hogan broke down in tears and then collapsed at Hulk Hogan's funeral. Fans, friends, and family were left in utter shock as emotions overflowed during this heartbreaking moment in wrestling history. In this video, we take you inside the emotional scenes from Hulk Hogan's funeral service, the tears, the tributes, and the reactions from WWE legends who witnessed it all. From Linda Hogan's devastating collapse to the stunned silence in the room, you'll hear the full story that shook the wrestling community. The day was supposed to be one of solemn remembrance, a final farewell to a man whose name was woven into the very fabric of professional wrestling history. Yet, as mourners gathered to pay tribute to Hulk Hogan, a sudden and unexpected moment would leave everyone in attendance frozen in shock. Linda Hogan, his former wife and once one of the closest people in his life, broke down in uncontrollable sobs, and then collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. What had begun as a day of honoring the life and legacy of the wrestling icon quickly became an emotionally charged scene that no one present would ever forget. The Florida morning was humid but bright, the kind of day where the sun seemed to spill through the windows of the chapel with almost blinding intensity. Hogan's funeral service had been arranged with both privacy and reverence in mind, held at a venue just outside Clearwater, a place he had called home for years. Friends, family, wrestling legends, and select members of the media had been invited, though every guest had been instructed to leave cameras and recording devices at the door. This was not a spectacle for public consumption, but a deeply personal moment for those who had loved and admired him. As people filed in, the room seemed heavy with both grief and awe. The casket, draped with a custom cover that displayed Hogan's trademark red and yellow colors, sat at the front of the chapel beneath a towering floral arrangement shaped like the WWE Championship belt. Nearby, framed photographs showed the different eras of his career, from the young, wide-eyed up-and-comer in the late 70s to the larger-than-life champion of the 80s, to his later years as a beloved elder statesman of the wrestling world. A hush fell over the attendees as the organist began to play a slow, mournful rendition of Real American, the theme song that had once electrified arenas across the globe. Now, in this context, it felt almost unbearably sad. Linda Hogan entered quietly, escorted by her son Nick. Though their marriage had ended years earlier in a very public and often turbulent way, there was no mistaking the depth of her connection to Hogan. She had known him long before the fame and fortune, back when he was just Terry Bollea. A man chasing a dream, unsure if the wrestling world would embrace him. Together, they had built a life, raised a family, and weathered the storms that came with global stardom. On this day, the differences and disputes of the past seemed to dissolve into the background, replaced by a raw, undeniable grief. Those who saw her walk in later described her as looking pale, her shoulders slightly hunched as though the weight of the day was pressing her down. Nick kept his hand gently on her arm as they made their way to the front pew, directly in view of the casket. Linda wore a simple black dress, understated jewelry, and no makeup beyond a faint layer to hide her swollen eyes. She kept her gaze low, as if looking directly at the casket might shatter what little composure she had left. The service began with eulogies from Hogan's closest friends in the wrestling business. Macho Man Randy Savage's brother, Lanny Poffo, spoke first, delivering heartfelt words about Hogan's loyalty and the behind-the-scenes kindness he often kept hidden from the cameras. WWE Hall of Famer Jimmy Hart followed, recalling road trips, late-night laughs, and moments when Hogan would go out of his way to help struggling wrestlers. The stories painted a picture not of the flamboyant superstar in the ring, but of the man outside it, compassionate, generous, and fiercely protective of those he loved. As the tributes continued, Linda sat with her head bowed, occasionally dabbing her eyes with a tissue. But when Brooke Hogan, their daughter, rose to speak, something in Linda seemed to break. Brooke's voice trembled as she talked about growing up with a father who was both a superhero to millions and simply dad to her. She recounted nights when he would sneak into her room after a long tour just to check if she was asleep, the way he'd always call her his little girl, even when she was an adult, and how, Despite his fame, he always made time for family. He wasn't perfect, Brooke admitted, her voice cracking, but he was ours, and I will never stop missing him. It was in that moment, as Brooke's words filled the chapel, that Linda let out a low, audible sob. Several attendees turned to look, concern etched across their faces. Nick leaned toward his mother, whispering something in an attempt to comfort her, but she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. The sight of her daughter speaking so openly about the man they had both loved, despite the divorce, despite the pain, seemed to overwhelm her entirely. When Brooke finished and returned to her seat, the organ began to play softly again. Linda rose from the pew, her movements slow and unsteady. Nick reached for her arm, but she gently pushed his hand away. She took a step toward the casket, her gaze finally lifting to meet the sight of the man she had once built a life with. The room seemed to grow still, as if everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would etch itself into the memory of the day. She stood there for a long moment, her face crumpling as the tears came faster. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but somehow carried through the silence, she said, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. No one knew exactly what she meant, perhaps an apology for the years they had spent apart, for the words said in anger, for not being there more in his final days. Or maybe it was simply the universal apology that comes when grief makes us wish we had done more. Before anyone could react, Linda's knees buckled. Nick lunged forward, catching her under the arms as gasps rippled through the crowd. For a brief moment, it looked as if she might steady herself, but then her body went limp, and Nick, with the help of two nearby friends, lowered her gently to the floor. The chapel erupted into quiet chaos. Several people rushed forward, among them former WWE star Brutus, the barber Beefcake, who had been a close friend of Hogan's for decades. Someone called for medical assistance, though a nurse who was attending as a guest was already at Linda's side, checking her pulse and speaking to her softly. The officiant at the service, clearly rattled, asked everyone to remain calm. "She's in good hands," he assured the room, though his voice betrayed his own concern. Those sitting closest could see Linda's chest rising and falling, though her eyes remained closed. Nick knelt beside her, stroking her hair and speaking words no one else could hear. Brooke, tears streaming down her own face, hurried to join them, her hand clutching her mother's tightly. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the entire room held its breath. Conversations dropped to whispers, and even the sound of the organ faded into the background. Some guests bowed their heads in silent prayer, others simply stared, too shocked to process what they were seeing. The reality of the moment, that on the very day they were saying goodbye to Hulk Hogan, they might be watching another tragedy unfold, was almost too much to bear. Finally, Linda stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at the faces surrounding her, confusion flickering across her expression. Nick and Brooke both leaned closer, speaking softly, and the nurse assured her she had likely fainted from a combination of emotional stress and the heat in the room. With help, she was slowly guided back to her feet and seated in a nearby chair. A bottle of water was placed in her hands, and she sipped it mechanically, her gaze still fixed on the casket at the front of the room. The service continued, though the atmosphere had shifted. The shock of seeing Linda collapse had shaken everyone. Wrestlers who had spent their careers projecting toughness now sat with glassy eyes, their expressions unreadable. Even Vince McMahon, known for his unflinching composure, was seen rubbing his temples and staring at the floor. Later, whispers would circulate about what exactly had caused Linda's collapse. Some speculated that it was the overwhelming emotional weight of the day, compounded by the sight of her children grieving so openly. Others wondered if the memories of her years with Hogan, both the joyful and the painful, had simply become too much to carry in that moment. Those close to her insisted it was a combination of factors: grief, exhaustion, and perhaps the guilt that often accompanies complicated relationships when one party is gone. After the service ended, mourners filed past the casket one final time. Linda, now steadier, returned to the front with Nick and Brooke at her side. She placed her hand gently on the casket, her eyes closing as she took a deep breath. No words this time, just a moment of silent connection, a final goodbye that transcended the years of distance and discord. Then she stepped back, allowing the next person in line to pay their respects. Outside the chapel, the Florida sun was blinding, a stark contrast to the dim, cool interior they had just left. People gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Some wrestlers embraced one another, their shared history with Hogan making the loss feel personal and profound. Others stood alone, staring off into the distance, perhaps reliving their own memories of the man who had been larger than life in every way. Linda was escorted to a waiting car, shielded from reporters who had gathered at a respectful distance beyond the venue's gates. Though no official statement was made about her collapse, those who had been inside knew they had witnessed a moment of unfiltered humanity, a reminder that grief has no script, no boundaries, and no concern for how it might be perceived. What lingered most for those who attended was not just the image of Hulk Hogan's casket or the tributes that had been paid, but the sight of Linda Hogan, a woman who had once been his partner in life, brought to her knees by the sheer force of loss. It was a moment that stripped away the layers of celebrity, history, and public perception, leaving only the raw truth that love, in all its forms, leaves an indelible mark. And when that love is gone, sometimes the weight of it can quite literally bring you to the ground. Even for a community as seasoned in loss as the wrestling world, it was a day that would never be forgotten, not for the grandeur of the tributes or the fame of those in attendance, but for the human fragility laid bare in that chapel. A reminder that behind the spectacle, the costumes, and the storylines, the people who make up this world bleed, break, and mourn just like anyone else. And for Linda Hogan, on that day, the mourning was too much to bear without her body itself giving way. The shockwave of that moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the chapel, into the hearts of everyone who had ever cheered for Hulk Hogan, reminding them that even the strongest heroes leave behind a wake of pain when they're gone. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky by the time most of the mourners had made their way from the chapel to the reception area. The venue's garden, a quiet stretch of manicured greenery with white chairs scattered under palm trees, had been prepared for guests to gather after the service. Soft background music played, a slow acoustic guitar arrangement that seemed to float on the humid Florida air. Trays of light refreshments were offered, but few people had the appetite. Conversation was muted, hushed, and broken by long pauses. The shock of Linda Hogan's collapse still clung to everyone like a shadow. Inside the garden, groups formed and reformed, wrestling legends leaning on each other for comfort, old friends reconnecting through shared grief, and family members clutching hands as if afraid of letting go. One corner of the garden seemed to naturally become the gathering point for several WWE icons. Nature Boy Ric Flair stood with his head slightly bowed, speaking quietly to Jimmy Hart. Both men had known Hogan for decades, having traveled the roads with him during the heyday of the wrestling boom. Every so often, one of them would glance toward the path leading to the chapel's entrance, as if waiting for Linda or Brooke to emerge. When Rick was approached by a younger wrestler who had idolized Hogan growing up, his eyes glistened as he tried to find words. "You think you're prepared for this," Flair said, his voice cracking just enough to betray the emotion behind it. "We've all lost friends, brothers, but this one, man, this one cuts deep." His hand rested on the younger wrestler's shoulder, the weight of his words heavy in the air. And seeing Linda like that, it reminded me just how real this all is. We're not invincible, no matter how much we pretend to be. At another table, Kevin Nash sat with Scott Hall's son, Cody, both sipping water in near silence. Nash's towering frame seemed smaller somehow, his usual easy confidence replaced by a solemn stillness. "We all worked with him, fought him, made money with him," Nash finally said, breaking the silence. "But behind the curtain, we shared something else, something most people out there will never understand. We lived through wars together, not the kind with bullets, but the kind where the next match could make or break you, where the crowd could love you one minute and turn on you the next. Terry was constant. He always had your back. Nash paused, looking out over the garden. And now, it's like a piece of that world is gone forever. Back near the garden entrance, several female wrestlers stood in a small, tight circle. Trish Stratus, Lita, and Mickie James had all been part of eras where Hogan's influence was still felt backstage, even if he wasn't wrestling as often. Trish, known for her calm and composed demeanor, had red eyes as she spoke. "It's strange," she said softly. "We didn't work in the same capacity as the guys did with him, but he still made an impact on us. He'd drop by at events, and it wasn't just about the cameras. He'd ask how we were doing, if we were being treated well. That mattered." Lita nodded. "Seeing Linda like that, it shows you how deep the bonds go, even after everything. Love like that doesn't just go away." From a distance, fans who had been permitted to gather outside the venue gates could only guess at what was unfolding inside. Though they hadn't witnessed Linda's collapse firsthand, the news had already begun to ripple through the crowd via text messages and whispered accounts from attendees. A murmur passed through them, an uneasy mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Some fans held up old wrestling programs and posters, not for autographs, but as a sort of tribute, clutching them close like relics. Back inside, Linda had been moved to a quieter part of the reception area. She sat on a cushioned bench beneath the shade of an overhanging palm, a glass of water in her hand. Nick sat beside her, one arm draped protectively across the back of the bench, while Brooke stood in front of them, speaking in a low, measured tone. The color had begun to return to Linda's face, but her eyes were distant, fixed somewhere far beyond the garden. From time to time, an old friend or former colleague of Hogan's would approach to offer a few words of comfort. Most spoke gently, mindful of how fragile the moment was. She would nod, murmur a soft "thank you," and return to her silence. One man who eventually approached was Eric Bischoff, a figure who had shared both triumphs and controversies with Hogan during their years in WCW. Bischoff crouched down slightly so he could meet Linda's gaze. "I know today's been impossible," he said quietly. "But I also know Terry would want you to remember the good. The laughs, the fights, the ridiculous things on the road. He lived a big life, and you were a part of that in a way no one else could ever be." For a moment, Linda's eyes flickered with something recognition, maybe even a hint of a smile. "We had our moments," she said, her voice hoarse. "Some good, some bad, but he was always larger than life." Meanwhile, Vince McMahon had kept to himself for much of the reception, standing with Triple H and Stephanie McMahon under the cover of a large umbrella near the garden's edge. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clasped tightly in front of him, a gesture that betrayed the weight of the day. Triple H spoke quietly to him at intervals, but Vince rarely responded with more than a nod. When asked later about his demeanor, one attendee remarked, "I think Vince understood better than most that this wasn't just about losing a superstar. This was about losing one of the pillars that built the whole house." As the afternoon wore on, the sun's angle shifted, casting longer shadows across the garden. Conversations began to turn toward shared memories, with laughter occasionally breaking through the somber mood. Jimmy Hart told a story about a time on the road when Hogan had convinced an entire diner's worth of patrons to sing "Happy Birthday" to a stranger just because the man looked like he needed cheering up. Kevin Nash recalled a prank war between Hogan and the NWO that ended with someone's rental car being filled with balloons. These moments of levity brought a measure of relief, a reminder that Hogan's life had been filled with joy as much as spectacle. But even as people smiled, the memory of Linda's earlier collapse lingered. It had served as a stark reminder that grief doesn't follow a polite schedule. It strikes when it chooses, in ways that can't be controlled. For those who knew the history between Linda and Hogan, it was a poignant symbol of the complexity of love and loss. Whatever had passed between them over the years, whatever wounds had been left unhealed, the sight of her crumpling under the weight of goodbye had made one thing clear: some bonds never truly break. As the reception drew to a close, attendees began to drift away in ones and twos. The WWE talent who had flown in for the service shook hands, embraced, and promised to stay in touch. Promises that everyone knew were easier made than kept, but sincere nonetheless. The family stayed behind for a few final private moments in the chapel, away from the crowd. Linda lingered for a long time before joining them, her steps slow but steady now. When she finally re-entered the chapel, it was empty except for the casket and a few rows of flowers. The air was cooler inside, the hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. She approached the casket one last time, placing both hands on the polished wood. No words came this time, perhaps they weren't needed. For a long while, she simply stood there, her head bowed, until Nick stepped forward and gently guided her away. Outside, the last of the cars pulled away from the venue, the sound of engines fading into the distance. The sun had nearly set, casting the sky in deep shades of gold and crimson, a fitting farewell for a man who had lived his life in bold, unforgettable colors. For those who had been inside the chapel that day, one image would endure above all others: Linda Hogan, overcome by the sheer weight of loss, reminding everyone present that even in a world built on larger-than-life characters, grief is the most human story of all, and for the wrestling world, that day was more than just the closing of a chapter. It was a reminder of the fragility of the people behind the personas, the cost of the lives they lived, and the love, however complicated, that binds them long after the cameras stop rolling. Linda's collapse was not just a moment of weakness. It was a moment of truth, and it will be remembered as such, woven forever into the legacy of Hulk Hogan and the family, friends, and fans he left behind. In the days that followed Hulk Hogan's funeral, the shockwaves from Linda Hogan's collapse rippled far beyond Clearwater. The scene inside the chapel, her trembling voice, the whispered apology at the casket, the way her knees buckled under the weight of emotion, had burned itself into the memory of everyone who had been there. But now, with the service over and the guests gone, the story began to take on a life of its own in the wider world. News outlets across the United States picked it up within hours, their headlines varying from tender to sensational. Linda Hogan overcome with grief at ex-husband's funeral, read one. Another, less delicate, blared, Linda Hogan collapses at Hulk's final farewell, mourners left stunned. Photos from outside the chapel showed her being helped to a car by Nick and Brooke, her face pale, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. The images were raw, unguarded, and they spread quickly, carried by both news networks and wrestling fan forums alike. On social media, the wrestling community began to pour out its collective grief. Twitter timelines were flooded with old photos, iconic match clips, and personal memories of Hogan from fans who had grown up watching him. But alongside the tributes to the man himself came an unexpected wave of empathy for Linda. Hashtags like #PrayersForLinda and #StayStrongHoganFamily began trending, fueled by fans who saw her collapse not as drama, but as the undeniable proof of how deep the pain ran. For those who knew the couple's history, her reaction was even more poignant. Their marriage had been messy in the public eye, marked by bitter court battles and tabloid scandals. Yet the image of her crumpled at his funeral cut through years of gossip. It reminded people that beneath the headlines, these were two people who had once built a life together, one that included raising children, weathering fame, and sharing countless private moments the public would never see. Inside WWE's headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, Hogan's death and the events of his funeral dominated internal conversations. Current superstars who had been too young to wrestle alongside him still recognized his influence on the business. Many had posted tributes in the days leading up to the service, but after Linda's collapse became public, some took to Instagram and Twitter again, this time, to reflect on the reality of grief. Becky Lynch shared a photo of herself as a child wearing a Hulkamania t-shirt, captioned, "Heroes aren't supposed to leave us, but they do. And the people they leave behind, they feel it harder than we can imagine. My heart is with the Hogan family." Seth Rollins reposted an old WWE promo shot of Hogan, writing simply, "Legend. Icon. Brother to so many of us. Rest easy." For some legends who couldn't attend in person, the funeral and Linda's collapse reopened wounds from their own losses. The Undertaker, who had been dealing with a lingering injury and couldn't make the trip to Florida, released a rare public statement. In this business, you see men fall in the ring and rise again. But when we lose one of our own, there's no comeback. Terry was larger than life, but he was also human. My prayers are with Linda, Brooke, Nick, and everyone who loved him. His words carried weight, not only because of his status in the wrestling world, but because Hogan had been a pivotal figure in his early WWE career. Meanwhile, outside the wrestling bubble, mainstream news outlets were revisiting Hogan's cultural impact. ESPN aired a short feature segment titled The Real American, remembering Hulk Hogan, weaving together his biggest matches, celebrity appearances, and charity work. They didn't shy away from the controversies that had colored his later years, but the piece ended on a simple, striking note: a still photo of Hogan holding the WWE Championship, smiling into the camera, with the words, "Thank you, Hulk," fading in over the image. For Linda, however, the days after the funeral were a blur. According to those close to her, she avoided the media entirely, retreating into the privacy of her home. Friends described her as exhausted, still processing the loss, and deeply moved by the unexpected outpouring of public support. Brooke visited daily, bringing meals and sitting with her mother for hours. Nick checked in constantly, reminding her to drink water, to rest, to take things one step at a time. But grief has a way of replaying moments on an endless loop, and those who saw Linda in those days said she kept returning to the same scene, standing before the casket, saying, "I'm sorry." No one could say for certain what she meant, and perhaps even she couldn't fully explain it. Sometimes apologies are less about specific acts and more about the weight of a shared history, the regrets, the missed chances, the things left unsaid until it's too late. The wrestling world, too, seemed unable to move on quickly from that image. Podcasts dedicated to wrestling history spent entire episodes dissecting Hogan's funeral, often focusing less on the speeches or celebrity attendance and more on Linda's collapse. Some hosts speculated about the emotional complexity of saying goodbye to an ex-spouse, especially one as intertwined with your life as Hogan had been. Others criticized the media for zeroing in on her pain instead of keeping the focus solely on Hogan's legacy. One particularly moving moment came on Chris Jericho's podcast, where he spoke about attending funerals of fellow wrestlers and seeing the walls come down in ways fans never imagine. "People think of us as characters," Jericho said. "But we're people. We have marriages, divorces, fights, reconciliations. At the end of the day, when you lose someone who is a part of your life, even if it was complicated, it breaks you down." Linda showed the world that, whether she meant to or not, even Hogan's old rivals in the business set aside past grudges. Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had clashed with Hogan in public comments over the years, posted a short video on Instagram. Sitting in his ranch kitchen with a mug of coffee in hand, Austin spoke plainly. "We didn't always see eye to eye, but I respected the hell out of Hulk Hogan. What he did for wrestling, you can't measure it. And seeing what happened with Linda, it just drives home how real this is. My condolences to her and the family." As the tributes continued, so did the stories, small, personal glimpses into Hogan's life that hadn't made the highlight reels. One former stagehand from WWE recalled how Hogan had once stayed an extra 2 hours after a taping to sign autographs for a group of Make-A-Wish kids who had arrived late due to travel delays. He kept saying, "I'm not going anywhere until they've all had their moment," the stagehand wrote on Facebook. "That's the Hulk I'll remember." These stories, combined with the raw emotion displayed at the funeral, created a sense that Hogan's passing had brought the wrestling community, often divided by rivalries, egos, and business politics, into a rare moment of unity. For a brief time, it wasn't about brands or promotions or grudges. It was about a man who had touched them all, in ways both big and small, and the people left behind to carry his memory forward, and at the center of it, whether she wanted to be or not, was Linda Hogan. Her collapse had become the visual shorthand for the depth of the loss. For some, it was uncomfortable to watch. For others, it was a reminder that, even in the world of scripted drama and larger-than-life personas, moments of unfiltered reality still break through. It was, perhaps, The most human moment in a week defined by the passing of a legend. A moment when the noise stopped, the crowd faded, and grief stood unchallenged in the center of the ring. The private memorial dinner took place 2 nights after the funeral, tucked away in one of Clearwater's most discreet waterfront restaurants, a place Hogan had loved for its seclusion and sweeping views of the Gulf. The owner, an old friend of his from the early days, had closed the entire venue for the evening. Only those who had been part of Hogan's inner circle were invited, and the guest list was deliberately short. It was a gathering not for the cameras, not for press releases, but for the people who had known Terry, not just Hulk Hogan. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the dining room was filled with a soft amber glow from candlelit tables. Outside, the gentle lap of waves against the dock could be heard whenever the door opened. Inside, there was a strange mix of laughter and silence, the kind that comes when grief loosens its grip just enough for people to share stories without breaking down completely. At one long table near the center, Ric Flair sat beside Jimmy Hart, with Kevin Nash and Eric Bischoff opposite them. Lita, Trish Stratus, and Mickie James had chosen a smaller table off to the side, occasionally leaning in to listen when an especially wild story was being told. Vince McMahon had not come. Some said he preferred to mourn privately. Others speculated he wanted the dinner to be about friendship, not corporate presence. Linda Hogan arrived quietly, accompanied by Nick and Brooke. Heads turned when she entered. It wasn't just because she was Hogan's ex-wife. It was because of what had happened in the chapel. People hadn't seen much of her since that moment. She had left the reception quickly and stayed out of public view entirely in the days after. Tonight would be her first time facing many of the people who had witnessed her collapse. She wore a dark blue dress, her hair pulled back, and though she looked more composed, there was still a fragility in the way she carried herself. Nick walked just half a step behind her, almost like a bodyguard, while Brooke kept a hand lightly on her mother's back. When they reached the center of the room, the conversations softened into murmurs before quieting altogether. Jimmy Hart, ever the peacemaker, was the first to rise. "Linda," he said warmly, moving toward her with open arms. "We're so glad you came." She embraced him briefly, and when she pulled back, there was a sheen in her eyes that suggested she was holding back tears. One by one, others approached: Ric Flair, Kevin Nash, Lita. Each offering a few words, a squeeze of the hand, a nod of respect. Dinner began without ceremony. The menu was filled with Hogan's favorites: grilled grouper, garlic butter shrimp, a perfectly cooked prime rib for those who wanted something heavier. Wine and beer flowed freely, though many stuck to water or soda, perhaps out of respect for the occasion. Between bites, conversations drifted between fond memories and moments of surreal humor. Ric Flair told the story of the time Hogan had convinced him to ride a mechanical bull in full ring gear at a county fair. Kevin Nash remembered a night in Japan when Hogan had negotiated a fan's autograph request into a charity donation on the spot, but as the evening wore on, the air seemed to grow heavier. People knew there were unspoken things in the room, unaddressed grief, unsaid apologies. The moment came when Eric Bischoff, who had been relatively quiet, set down his fork and looked toward Linda. "I think we all know tonight isn't just about stories," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've lost someone who meant the world to us in a million different ways. And Linda, I think some of us have wanted to hear from you if you feel up to it." All eyes turned to her. For a heartbeat, she seemed frozen, as if considering whether to speak at all. But then she placed her napkin gently on the table, took a sip of water, and stood. The clinking of cutlery and low murmurs died away. "I wasn't sure I could come here tonight," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "2 days ago, I thought I'd embarrass myself in front of everyone who mattered to him. I thought you'd all remember me as the woman who couldn't keep it together, who collapsed when I should have been strong." She paused, glancing toward Nick and Brooke before continuing. "But the truth is, I didn't collapse because I was weak. I collapsed because for the first time in years, I let myself feel everything." Her words seemed to ripple through the room. She took a slow breath. "Terry and I had a complicated life together. We loved hard, we fought hard, and sometimes we hurt each other more than we should have. but no matter what happened between us, he was the love of my life. And standing in front of that casket, all I could think about was how much of our story will never have an ending now. All the things I didn't say, all the moments we'll never get back. It hit me all at once, and my body just gave out. A few people in the room shifted in their seats, visibly moved. Ric Flair nodded slowly, as though he understood completely. Linda's voice softened. I want you all to know, every one of you, that I'm grateful for the way you loved him, protected him, traveled with him, fought beside him. He was proud of you. Even in the worst times, he would tell me stories about the people in this room with a smile on his face. And I think he would be glad to know we're here together tonight. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze falling to the floor before lifting again. I don't know what people outside this room will say about me after the funeral, but I do know that in here, with the people who knew him best, I can be honest. I loved him until the very end. And I'll miss him every single day until my own. There was a long silence after she finished. Not awkward, but reverent. Jimmy Hart reached for her hand. Kevin Nash lifted his glass and said, "To Terry." Everyone followed suit, glasses raised high. "To Terry," the room echoed, voices thick with emotion. As the night continued, the atmosphere shifted again, lighter now, though still tinged with sadness. Linda stayed, listening to more stories, even laughing quietly at some of the more outrageous road tales. People who had been unsure how to approach her after the collapse now found it easy to sit beside her, share a memory, or simply keep her company. Outside, the water lapped softly against the dock as the tide rolled in. Inside, the bonds between everyone in that room, forged through decades of matches, travel, triumphs, and losses, felt just a little bit stronger. The dinner wound down well past midnight, but no one seemed eager to leave. It wasn't just about saying goodbye to Hulk Hogan anymore. It was about holding onto the people who remained, and for Linda Hogan, it was about reclaiming her place among them, not as a headline or a scandal, but as someone who had loved him deeply. In her own imperfect way. The collapse in the chapel had shown the world her breaking point. This night had shown the people who mattered that she still had the strength to stand again. 3 days after the private memorial dinner, Linda Hogan sat alone in the sunroom of her Clearwater home, the mid-morning light spilling through the glass and casting warm squares across the tiled floor. The house was quiet, eerily so. Brooke had returned to her own home the day before, and Nick had gone to handle some legal matters related to his father's estate. For the first time since the funeral, Linda found herself without the buffer of company. It was in that stillness that the knock came. Soft, hesitant. When she opened the door, she found a familiar face, Brian Knobs, one of Hogan's oldest friends and a fixture in his life for decades. Brian wasn't smiling. His usual boisterous demeanor was muted, replaced by an air of solemn purpose. In his hands, he carried a simple manila envelope. "Linda," he said, his voice low, "Terry wanted you to have this." She frowned, glancing at the envelope. "What is it?" Brian shook his head gently. "I don't know all of it. He gave it to me months ago, told me to make sure it got to you, if the time ever came. I think he knew he wouldn't be able to give it to you himself." Linda hesitated, her pulse quickening. Her first instinct was to refuse, to tell him she wasn't ready. But something in Brian's expression told her this wasn't a gesture to be delayed. She took the envelope from his hands, the weight of it surprisingly light, yet heavy with implication. Brian squeezed her arm gently before stepping back. "Take your time," he said. And, whatever's in there, I think he meant every word. When he left, Linda stood for a long moment in the doorway, the envelope clutched in her hands. Finally, she returned to the sunroom and sat down in her favorite chair, the one that faced the water. The envelope wasn't sealed, just folded over at the top. She opened it slowly, as if each second she delayed might somehow prepare her for what was inside. There was a single folded sheet of paper, creased neatly down the middle. The handwriting, bold, slanted, unmistakably his, sent a jolt through her. She had seen those letters 1,000 times on signed contracts, birthday cards, and little notes left around the house during their marriage. She unfolded it. "Linda, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I don't know how you'll feel in this moment. Maybe angry, maybe sad, maybe both. We didn't always get it right, you and me. We had some beautiful years, and we had some ugly ones too. But I need you to know something before anything else. I never stopped caring about you. Even when we were at our worst, I'd still find myself thinking about some random day from the past, you laughing at something dumb I said in the kitchen, or the way you looked in the front row when I wrestled in Tampa back in the early days. I'd think about those things and realize they were part of the reason I kept going. You reminded me that I was more than Hulk Hogan. You knew me when I was just Terry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I'm sorry for the words I can't take back, and for the times I let the business get in the way of us. If I could go back, I'd have spent more time being your husband and less time being everybody else's hero. That's the truth. If I'm lucky, you'll remember me as more than my mistakes. I hope you'll remember the good, the nights we stayed up talking until sunrise, the way we were when it was just us, before the cameras and the chaos. I hope you know that somewhere in all the noise, my love for you is still there. Take care of yourself, Linda. Be there for the kids. And when you think of me, I hope it's with a smile, not a tear. Terry. Linda's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. She had expected something perfunctory, a polite farewell, maybe even a guarded note out of obligation. But this was different. It was honest in a way Hogan rarely allowed himself to be, especially in writing. There were no grand gestures, no melodrama, just raw truth. The tears came before she could stop them. They weren't the violent, uncontrollable sobs that had overtaken her at the funeral. These were quieter, heavier, like rain soaking into the earth after a long drought. She pressed the paper to her chest and leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as memories began to unspool in her mind. She remembered the first time she'd met him, back when he was just a big guy with a big dream, still a little unsure of himself. She remembered road trips in beat-up cars, shared meals in roadside diners, and nights in cheap motels where they'd laugh about how far they'd come. She remembered the way he'd look at her after a big match, exhausted but grinning, as if to say, "We made it," and she remembered the fights, the slammed doors, the long silences, the words meant to wound. But somehow, even those memories felt different now. The sharp edges had been dulled by time and by the finality of loss. She read the letter again, slower this time, lingering on each line. The apology, the admissions, the hope that she would remember the good. For the first time since the funeral, she felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but now it was tangled with a sense of closure she hadn't expected to find. When Nick returned later that afternoon, he found her sitting in the same chair, the letter folded neatly on the table beside her. "Mom," he said cautiously, "are you okay?" Linda looked up at him, her eyes still red but her expression softer. She reached out, taking his hand. "I will be," she said. "Your dad. He left me something. Something I didn't know I needed." That evening, she called Brooke and asked her to come over. When her daughter arrived, Linda showed her the letter. They sat together on the couch, reading it again and again, sometimes in silence, sometimes stopping to share a memory sparked by a sentence. By the time they finished, Brooke was crying too, but like her mother, she seemed lighter, as if the words had eased a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. Word of the letter didn't leave the family. It wasn't for the public, wasn't meant to be dissected by commentators or shared on social media. But in their private world, it became a kind of anchor, a final connection to Hogan that was deeply personal, untouched by the noise of the wrestling industry or the judgment of strangers. In the weeks that followed, Linda began to reframe her memories of him. The collapse at the funeral was still vivid, but now it felt less like the defining moment of her goodbye and more like a bridge to this one, the quiet morning in her sunroom, reading his words for the first time. She knew the grief would return in waves, and that there would be days when the loss would feel unbearable again. But she also knew that the letter had given her something rare, the permission to remember him not just as the man the world saw, but as the man she had loved, flaws and all, and in that, she found a kind of peace. Not the absence of pain, but the acceptance that pain and love often walk hand in hand. It was the kind of peace that allowed her to stand without her knees giving way, to speak without her voice breaking, and to carry his memory without being crushed by its weight. It was just over a month after the funeral when the WWE Universe gathered for what had been billed as one of the most emotional episodes of the year. A live, televised tribute to Hulk Hogan. The arena was sold out well before bell time, but the mood was unlike any other show. There were no booming pyrotechnics to start the night, no flashy opening package hyping upcoming matches. Instead, the lights dimmed to a soft glow as the giant LED screen above the stage displayed Hogan's smiling face, frozen in one of his classic poses, cupping his hand to his ear as if listening to the roar of the crowd. A video montage began to roll. It wasn't just highlights of title wins and iconic WrestleMania moments. It included candid footage, Hogan signing autographs for kids at airports, joking backstage with fellow wrestlers, sharing quiet moments with Make-A-Wish families. The soundtrack was a slow piano version of Real American, stripped of its bombastic energy, the melody carrying a quiet ache. Fans stood silently, many holding homemade signs. "Thank you, Hulk, forever a real American. We'll miss you, brother." As the montage faded to black, the lights came up on the entrance ramp, and the audience saw a sight they didn't expect: Linda Hogan, flanked by Brooke and Nick. The reaction was instant, a stunned silence, followed by a swelling wave of applause. Some fans gasped audibly. This was the first time Linda had appeared in any public capacity since the funeral, the first time anyone outside that private circle had seen her since her collapse in the chapel. She was dressed simply, a black suit with a white blouse, her hair neatly pulled back. In her hands, she clutched a microphone, and though her posture was upright, there was a visible tremor in her grip. Brooke walked close on her right, Nick on her left, both of them lending a quiet, protective presence as the three made their way slowly down the ramp. When they reached the ring, Linda paused at the steel steps, glancing briefly at the packed crowd. The noise was still building: cheers, chants of "Hogan! Hogan!" rising from all corners of the arena. She stepped between the ropes, guided by her children, and stood in the center of the squared circle. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked around, taking in the sight of thousands of fans standing shoulder to shoulder, united in one purpose: to honor the man she had once shared her life with. The chants softened into an expectant hush. "I wasn't sure I could do this," she began, her voice catching on the first words. "I told myself I'd never stand in a wrestling ring again, but tonight isn't about me. It's about Terry." The use of his real name drew a ripple through the crowd, a reminder that beyond the larger-than-life character, there was a man. Linda's eyes glistened, but she pressed on. "I know most of you knew him as Hulk Hogan, the hero, the showman, the champion. But I want you to know that the man behind that persona was just as incredible in ways you never saw. He was a father who called his kids before every big match just to hear their voices. He was a friend who would drive 2 hours out of his way to surprise someone on their birthday. He was stubborn, he was imperfect, but he loved fiercely." She paused, glancing briefly toward the entrance stage where current and former WWE stars stood in a line, all wearing black armbands with HH stitched in gold. "At the funeral, I lost control. I let the grief take me down in front of everyone. And for a long time, I thought that moment would define me. But I've realized something in the weeks since. That collapse wasn't weakness. It was love. It was every memory, every regret, every ounce of what we shared hitting me at once." The crowd began to applaud, some fans shouting words of encouragement. Linda's voice steadied. "A few days after the funeral, I received a letter from Terry, one he wrote before he passed. In it, he told me he never stopped caring. That even when life pulled us apart, he remembered the good. He asked me to smile when I thought of him, not to cry. And I think that's what tonight is about, smiling through the tears. Remembering the man who gave so much to all of us." The cameras cut to the stage, where Ric Flair wiped his eyes and Kevin Nash bowed his head. Back in the ring, Linda took a deep breath. "So tonight, I want to say thank you to the WWE family for honoring him in the way only you can. To the fans for keeping his spirit alive in every cheer, every chant, every red and yellow shirt. And to Terry, for the love, the memories, and the life we built, even if it didn't last the way we thought it would. I'll carry you with me always. The crowd erupted into a chant of, "Thank you, Linda," which seemed to take her by surprise. She smiled faintly, a smile that was equal parts grief and gratitude, and handed the microphone to Brooke. Brooke spoke briefly about her father's unwavering belief in chasing dreams, while Nick shared a short story about the time Hogan insisted on helping him fix his first car, even though neither of them had any idea what they were doing when their words were done. The three of them stepped back, and the arena lights dimmed again. A final video played, a montage of Hogan cupping his hand to his ear, posing with the championship, and pointing into the camera with his famous, "What ya gonna do" grin. But instead of fading out on that image, the video ended with a still photograph of Hogan and Linda from their early days, standing together at a county fair, arms around each other, both laughing. As the lights came back up, the crowd roared one last time. Linda, Brooke, and Nick stepped out of the ring and made their way slowly up the ramp. Halfway up, Linda paused, turned back toward the ring, and raised her hand in a small wave. It wasn't the exaggerated wave of a wrestling personality. It was quiet, personal, meant for anyone who understood the journey she'd been on. Backstage after the segment, several wrestlers approached her to offer hugs and words of support. Ric Flair told her, "You did him proud tonight." Kevin Nash simply said, "That took guts." Even Triple H, who had kept his distance from the Hogan family in recent years, shook her hand and thanked her for coming. That night, the tribute trended worldwide, with clips of Linda's speech shared across social media. Fans debated her words, some focusing on the revelations about Hogan's private side, others praising her courage in speaking publicly so soon after his death. But for Linda, the opinions didn't matter. She had stood in the ring not as an ex-wife seeking the spotlight, but as someone who had loved the man behind the legend, and in doing so, she felt she had honored both him and herself. In the weeks following Linda Hogan's surprise appearance at the WWE Memorial Show, the ripples of her tribute spread far beyond the wrestling world. Clips of her standing in the ring, her voice wavering at first, then gaining strength as she spoke about the man behind the Hulk Hogan persona, were replayed on sports networks, entertainment news shows, and countless YouTube channels. For many fans, it was the first time they had ever seen Linda not as a supporting character in Hogan's public life or as a tabloid headline, but as her own person, vulnerable, candid, and unafraid to acknowledge the complicated truth of their shared history. That authenticity struck a chord. Online, the tone toward her shifted almost overnight. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now empathy. Wrestling forums that had been critical of her in the past lit up with posts praising her courage. "I didn't think much of Linda before," one fan wrote, "but seeing her stand there, sharing those words, it was real. You could feel it." Another simply posted, "She loved him. You can't fake that." The ripple effect didn't stop with fans. Wrestlers and personalities from across promotions began opening up about their own experiences with grief in ways they hadn't before. A week after Linda's speech, Mick Foley recorded a heartfelt video for his social media followers, talking about the death of his friend Brian Hildebrand and how long it took him to speak publicly about it. "Linda reminded me," Foley said, "that there's no shame in letting the world see you hurting. That's how people heal together." The widows and family members of other wrestling legends began to reach out to Linda privately. Some sent flowers or cards. Others sent messages through mutual friends, thanking her for showing that it was possible to grieve publicly without losing dignity. One email from the wife of a late Hall of Famer simply read, "I saw you, and I felt less alone." Even WWE seemed to recognize the impact of her appearance. Within a month, they announced a short video series on the WWE Network titled Beyond the Spotlight, Wrestling Families Remember, aimed at giving space to the spouses, children, and friends of wrestlers to share stories about life behind the scenes. Linda was not involved in producing the series, but sources backstage admitted her speech had sparked the idea. Mainstream outlets followed the story too. People magazine ran a feature titled "Linda Hogan Finds Her Voice in Grief," accompanied by photos from the memorial show and quiet moments at her Clearwater home. The piece portrayed her not as a scandalous figure from the past, but as a woman finding her footing after a seismic loss. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome came from the fans themselves. Across the country, and even internationally, small fan-organized tribute events for Hogan began popping up. At one in Tampa, attendees held a moment of silence before showing a recording of Linda's speech on a projector screen. Some wore red and yellow, others simply came to share stories of how Hogan's career had shaped their childhoods. When Linda heard about these gatherings, she was moved. At first, she resisted the idea of attending any, fearing it might feel performative or reopen wounds that were still healing. But after much persuasion from Brooke, she agreed to appear at a small fan memorial in Orlando. She kept her remarks brief, standing on a modest stage in front of a crowd of about 200. "I didn't know how much Terry meant to all of you until I saw it with my own eyes," she told them. "It makes me proud. It makes me grateful. And it reminds me that his life was about more than what happened in the ring. It was about the people he inspired." The crowd cheered, some visibly emotional. In the months that followed, Linda found herself drawn more and more into this evolving role, not a replacement for Hogan, not an official WWE ambassador, but a bridge between the fans and the man they had adored. She began working quietly with a few charities Hogan had supported during his life, including children's hospitals and veterans organizations. She even helped set up a scholarship fund in his name, something she had discussed privately with Brooke and Nick after reading his final letter. Public opinion polls in entertainment media, the kind that once delighted in ranking celebrity likability, reflected the change. Linda's favorability ratings climbed steadily, driven largely by fans who said they had a newfound respect for her. The collapse at the funeral, which had once been the defining image of her grief, was now seen through a different lens. It was no longer a moment of perceived fragility. It had become the prologue to a story of resilience. Even so, Linda was careful not to overstep. She turned down several offers to do in-depth TV interviews about her marriage, wary of turning her late husband's memory into a spectacle. When she did speak publicly, it was almost always in service of honoring his legacy or supporting causes he had cared about. In private, however, she continued to wrestle with the personal side of her loss. There were mornings she would wake up expecting to see his name pop up on her phone, afternoons when she'd catch herself thinking of something she wanted to tell him. The letter Brian Knobs had delivered remained on her nightstand, folded neatly in the same envelope, a touchstone she returned to on difficult days. But one thing was certain, she no longer felt like she was navigating that grief in isolation. The fans, the wrestlers, the families, they had become part of her circle, a community that understood the peculiar pain and pride of loving someone whose life was lived in the public eye. And as months turned into a year, Linda realized that while she could never fill the space Hogan left behind, she could help ensure it was honored. The one-year anniversary of Hulk Hogan's passing arrived with a gravity that even the most seasoned wrestling veterans admitted they could feel in their bones. Clearwater had been chosen as the site of the official public memorial, not just because it was where Hogan had lived, but because it was where his presence seemed to linger most. Every street corner, every diner, every stretch of beach seemed to hold a piece of him. The city embraced the occasion, lining streets with banners in red and yellow, each bearing Hogan's image and the words, "Forever a Real American." Local businesses joined in. Shop windows displayed vintage action figures, gyms hung old event posters, and restaurants added his favorite meals to their menus for the week. The memorial was set up outdoors at Coachman Park, overlooking the water. By noon, thousands of fans had gathered, some traveling from across the country, others from as far as Japan, Canada, and the UK. Many wore Hogan's signature colors, feather boas and bandanas, turning the park into a sea of gold and crimson. The stage was simple but striking, a massive screen in the center showing a slow rotation of photos from Hogan's life, flanked by two smaller screens for the live broadcast. In front, a long row of empty chairs had been placed for family, friends, and wrestling legends. WWE had provided production support, ensuring the event would be streamed worldwide. Linda Hogan arrived quietly with Brooke and Nick, entering from a side pathway to avoid the throng of fans pressing against the barricades. She wore a black dress adorned with a small yellow ribbon, and on her wrist was a bracelet Hogan had given her decades earlier, back when they were just beginning their journey together. As she took her seat, fans began chanting her name softly, a sign of the respect she had earned over the past year. The program opened with video messages from those who couldn't attend: The Rock, John Cena, even Dwayne Johnson's mother, who spoke about Hogan's kindness toward their family during the early days. Ric Flair, Kevin Nash, and Jimmy Hart took turns on stage, sharing a mix of heartfelt memories and laugh-out-loud road stories. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The host, his voice reverent, announced, "Please welcome, for what she tells us will be her final public tribute, Linda Hogan." She rose slowly, accepting a hand from Nick as she stepped toward the podium. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, rolling across the park like a wave. She took a moment to steady herself, looking out over the thousands of faces, some tearful, some smiling, all united in honoring the same man. "Last year," she began, "I stood in front of a casket and couldn't stand on my own.